The rain had stopped an hour before, but the roads were still slick and dark with it, reflecting the last gray light of a November afternoon. County Road 12 curved through the hills east of Ardmore, Oklahoma, the kind of road that rewarded caution and punished those who forgot it. The leaves had turned weeks ago, and now they lay in wet drifts along the shoulders, beautiful and treacherous. Marcus Cole saw the deer a half second before it saw him. He was doing maybe 45, taking the curve easy, the way he'd learned to do after 30 years of riding. But the doe came out of the tree line like a ghost, all legs in panic, and his front tire hit the wet leaves before his brain could finish telling his hands what to do. The bike went sideways. Marcus went with it. The world became a blur of gray sky and black asphalt, and the particular silence that comes when you're falling and there's nothing left to do but wait for the ground. He hit hard, shoulder first, and slid. The bike kept going, spinning across the road in a shower of sparks until it came to rest against a fence post with a sound like a church bell struck wrong. Marcus lay on his back in the middle of the road, staring up at the clouds. His left arm wasn't working right. His helmet had cracked. He could feel the cold air against his scalp where it shouldn't be. Somewhere nearby, the deer was probably already gone, bounding off through the woods, unaware of what it had done. He tried to sit up. The pain made him stop. He was 51 years old, vice president of the Iron Confederates out of Oklahoma City, and he'd been riding since he was 16. He'd laid down bikes before. He knew what broken felt like. This was broken. The sound of footsteps made him turn his head. A boy was running toward him from a farmhouse set back from the road, a white 2-story place with a wrap-around porch and a tire swing hanging from an oak tree. The boy was small, maybe 7 or 8, with red hair that stuck up in the back and a jacket that was too big for him. He was moving fast, his sneakers slapping against the wet pavement. Mister, are you okay?" Marcus tried to answer, but the words came out wrong, slurred and distant. The boy skidded to a stop beside him, his eyes wide, his breath coming in quick clouds. "Don't move," the boy said. "My mom says you're not supposed to move people who got hurt. I'm going to get help." "Kid," Marcus managed, but the boy was already pulling something from his pocket. A phone. Too big for his small hands, the screen cracked in one corner. He fumbled with it, his fingers shaking, and Marcus realized the kid was terrified. Absolutely terrified, and doing it anyway. 911? There's a man on the road. He crashed his motorcycle, County Road 12 by the Jessup farm. He's bleeding, I think. Please hurry. The boy stayed on the line, answering questions Marcus couldn't quite hear, his voice steady, even though his hands weren't. When he hung up, he knelt down beside Marcus and did something that surprised him. He took off his oversized jacket and laid it gently over Marcus's chest. "The lady said to keep you warm," the boy explained. "She said help is coming." Marcus looked at the boy's thin arms, the goosebumps already rising on his skin. "You'll freeze, kid." "I'm okay. My house is right there." The boy pointed toward the farmhouse. "My name's Ethan. Ethan Jessup. What's yours?" "Marcus." "That's a cool name." Ethan sat down on the wet road beside him, cross-legged, like they were just two people having a conversation and not a grown man bleeding on asphalt and a child who should have been inside where it was warm. "My dad had a motorcycle once, before he got sick." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. His vision was getting fuzzy at the edges, and he was having trouble holding on to thoughts, but the boy kept talking, filling the silence with words that didn't seem to need answers. "He used to take me for rides, just around the property, not on the real roads. Mom said I was too little for the real roads, but it was fun. I liked the way it sounded." "Yeah," Marcus said. "It's a good sound. Is your motorcycle okay?" Marcus turned his head enough to see the bike against the fence post. The front wheel was bent at an angle that made his stomach turn. "Probably not." "That's okay. Motorcycles can be fixed. That's what my dad used to say. Motorcycles can be fixed, but people got to be careful because people are harder." The boy's voice wavered on the last word, just slightly, and Marcus understood something he hadn't before. The kid wasn't just scared for a stranger on the road. He was scared because he'd seen someone he loved get hurt, and that kind of fear never really went away. "Your dad," Marcus said. "He's still sick?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. His hands fidgeted with the edge of Marcus's jacket. "He died. Last year. Cancer." The word hung in the air between them, small and enormous at the same time. I'm sorry, kid. It's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but that's what people say. Ethan looked up at the sky, blinking. Mom says he's watching us. I don't know if that's true, but I like to think maybe he is. Maybe he saw me help you. Marcus felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the broken ribs. He thought about his own son, grown now, living in Denver, working some office job they never talked about. He thought about all the years he'd spent on the road instead of at home, all the birthdays missed, all the conversations that never happened. He thought about a boy sitting on wet asphalt in the cold because a stranger needed help and no one else was there. The sirens came wailing over the hill, red and blue lights cutting through the gray afternoon. The ambulance pulled up first, then a sheriff's cruiser. Suddenly there were people everywhere, voices and hands and equipment. Someone lifted Ethan gently away from Marcus, and a paramedic started asking questions Marcus could barely follow. But before they loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed the paramedic's arm. "The boy," he said, "the one who called. Make sure someone thanks him. Make sure his mother knows." The paramedic nodded, probably just to placate him, and then Marcus was inside the ambulance, and the doors were closing, and the world became a blur of fluorescent light and the wail of the siren. He didn't see Ethan again that day, but he didn't forget him either. In the weeks that followed, as Marcus healed in a hospital bed in Oklahoma City, with his arm in a cast and his ribs wrapped tight, he thought about that boy on the road, the oversized jacket, the cracked phone, the steady voice that shook but didn't stop. He thought about a father who died too young, and a son who still believed he might be watching. And he started making phone calls. The Iron Confederates had chapters across 3 states. They had connections, resources, a network built on loyalty and the open road. Marcus had been part of that world for 3 decades, and in all that time, he'd never asked for anything personal. He paid his dues, rode his miles, kept his word. That was the deal. But now he was asking, and when the brothers heard why, they didn't hesitate. Something was coming to Ardmore. Ethan Jessup just didn't know it yet. The Jessup farm had been in the family for 4 generations, passed down from father to son like a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. 80 acres of rolling Oklahoma hills, a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, a barn that had been painted red so many times the wood beneath had forgotten its original color. It wasn't much by modern standards, but it had been enough. Until it wasn't. Sarah Jessup stood at the kitchen sink, her hands in soapy water, staring out the window at the fields she could no longer afford to plant. The letter from the bank sat on the table behind her, unopened. She didn't need to open it. She knew what it said. They all said the same thing now, just with different numbers and different deadlines. 60 days. That was what the last one had given her. 60 days to come up with $18,000 or the farm would go to auction. She'd done the math 100 times, lying awake at 3 a.m, while Ethan slept down the hall. She could sell the tractor, maybe get $4,000 for it if she was lucky. The cattle had already been sold last spring to cover Danny's medical bills. There was nothing left to sell except the land itself, and selling the land meant selling everything her husband had worked for, everything his father had worked for, everything that was supposed to be Ethan's someday. She pulled her hands from the water and dried them on a dish towel that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to ghosts. Through the window, she could see Ethan in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball for their old border collie, Max. The dog was too arthritic to run properly anymore, but he tried anyway, his tail wagging with the same stubborn joy he'd had as a puppy. Ethan had been different since the accident 3 weeks ago, quieter in some ways, but steadier too. He'd told her the whole story that night, sitting at this same table with a cup of hot chocolate she'd made to stop his shivering. The man on the road, the blood, the way he'd called 911 and stayed with him until help came. She'd held him tight and told him she was proud, and she was, fiercely, desperately proud, but underneath that pride was a fear she couldn't name. Her 7-year-old had seen things no 7-year-old should have to see, and she hadn't been there to protect him from it. The phone rang. Sarah wiped her hands again and picked it up, expecting another robocall, another debt collector, another voice asking for money she didn't have. "Mrs. Jessup?" The voice was female, professional. "This is Carter County Memorial Hospital. I'm calling on behalf of a patient who was treated here recently, a Mr. Marcus Cole." Sarah frowned. The man from the accident? Is he all right?" "He's been discharged, ma'am, but he asked us to pass along a message. He'd like to speak with you, if you're willing. He left a number." Sarah wrote the number on the back of an envelope and stared at it for a long time after she hung up. She wasn't sure what a biker from Oklahoma City could possibly want to say to her. Probably just wanted to thank Ethan, which was kind but unnecessary. The boy had done what anyone should do, what Danny would have done. She almost didn't call, but something, curiosity maybe, or the need to hear a voice that wasn't a bill collector, made her pick up the phone again. Marcus answered on the second ring. His voice was rougher than she expected, like gravel that had been worn smooth in some places and left sharp in others. "Mrs. Jessup, thank you for calling. The hospital said you wanted to speak with me. I wanted to thank you, and your son. What he did." Marcus paused, and Sarah heard something shift in his tone, something that surprised her. Emotion, barely held in check. "I've been riding 30 years. I've seen men walk past accidents without stopping. I've seen people take pictures instead of calling for help. Your boy sat with me in the cold and gave me his jacket and talked to me so I wouldn't be scared. He's 7 years old, and he did what grown men don't have the guts to do." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "He's a good boy. His father raised him right." "His father's gone, I heard." "Yes." The silence stretched between them, filled with things neither of them said. "Mrs. Jessup, I'm not a man who likes to pry, but I asked around a little. Small town, people talk. I heard you're having some trouble with the bank." Sarah stiffened. "That's not really—" "I know it's not my business. I'm not trying to make it my business. But I owe your son a debt, and where I come from, debts get paid." His voice was steady now, the gravel smoothed over. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering help. There's a difference." "Mr. Cole—" "Marcus. Marcus." She closed her eyes. "I appreciate the thought. I do. But we're fine. We'll figure it out." 60 days isn't a lot of time to figure out $18,000. The number hit her like a slap. She hadn't told anyone the exact amount, which meant someone had been digging, asking questions, pulling at threads she'd tried to keep buried. "How do you know that?" "Like I said, people talk." Marcus's voice softened just slightly. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Mrs. Jessup. I'm trying to help. Your boy saved my life. Maybe not literally, but close enough. I was lying on that road thinking about all the things I'd done wrong, all the people I'd let down, and then this kid shows up and reminds me that the world still has good in it. That's worth something. That's worth a lot." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, to refuse, to protect what little pride she had left, but the words wouldn't come. She thought about Ethan in the backyard, throwing a ball for a dog that was too old to catch it. She thought about Danny, who had worked himself to exhaustion trying to keep this farm alive, and then worked himself to death when his body started failing. She thought about 60 days and $18,000, and the letter on the table she still couldn't bring herself to open. "What kind of help?" she heard herself ask. "I don't know yet, but I've got people. People who owe me favors, people who know how to get things done. Let me make some calls. Let me see what's possible." He paused. "All I'm asking is that you don't give up yet. Can you do that?" Sarah looked out the window at her son, at the fields, at the home she was terrified of losing. "I can try," she said. "That's all any of us can do." She hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, the envelope with Marcus's number still in her hand. Outside, Ethan had stopped throwing the ball. He was sitting in the grass with Max's head in his lap, staring up at the sky the way he did sometimes when he was thinking about his father. Sarah didn't know what Marcus Cole could possibly do. She didn't know if his help would amount to anything, or if it was just the empty promise of a man feeling grateful and guilty in equal measure. But for the first time in months, something other than dread had taken root in her chest. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was smaller than that, more fragile, but it was enough to make her open the letter from the bank and read it all the way through. Marcus Cole had never been good at asking for help. It was one of the things his ex-wife had told him years ago, when she was packing her bags and their son was pretending not to hear them argue through the walls. "You'd rather drown than admit you're in over your head." She'd been right. He'd spent most of his life proving her right, over and over, until the people who loved him got tired of watching him sink. But this wasn't about him. This was about a boy who'd sat on wet asphalt in the cold and talked about his dead father like it was the most natural thing in the world. This was about a woman trying to hold together a life that kept coming apart at the seams. This was about a debt Marcus hadn't earned and didn't deserve, but intended to pay anyway. He made his first call from the hospital bed 2 days after the accident, his left arm immobilized and his ribs screaming every time he breathed too deep. Hector Razorback Fuentes, president of the Iron Confederates, answered on the fourth ring. "Heard you tried to fight a deer," Razorback said. "Deer won. Deer cheated." Marcus shifted against the pillows, wincing. "I need a favor." "Name it." Marcus told him the story. The crash, the boy, the jacket laid across his chest by hands too small to be doing what they were doing. He told him about the phone call with Sarah Jessup, the farm in foreclosure, the $18,000 that might as well have been $18 million. He told him what he wanted to do about it. Razorback was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The jokes were gone. "You're serious? Dead serious? That's a lot of money, brother. Club's not a charity." "I'm not asking for club money. I'm asking for club reach. We've got 8 chapters across Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas. We've got mechanics, contractors, guys who own businesses. We've got people who know people." Marcus paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I'm not asking anyone to write a check. I'm asking them to show up. If we can get enough bodies together, enough noise, we can turn this into something, a fundraiser, an event, something that gets attention. Attention can cut both ways. I know, but this family's got nothing left to lose, and that boy deserves better than watching his mother lose the only home he's ever known." Marcus let that sit for a moment. "I'm going to do this with or without the club, but it'll mean a hell of a lot more with." The silence stretched. Marcus could hear Razorback breathing, the faint creak of a chair, the muffled sound of a television somewhere in the background. "Let me make some calls," Razorback said finally. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll see what's out there." "That's all I'm asking." Marcus hung up and stared at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about his son in Denver, the one he never called, the one who'd stopped calling him years ago. He thought about all the rides he'd taken, all the miles he'd put between himself and the people who mattered. He thought about a boy named Ethan who'd lost his father and still believed that fathers were worth looking up to. The calls kept going out over the next 2 weeks. Razorback talked to the chapter presidents in Tulsa and Dallas. They talked to their guys, who talked to their friends, who talked to their cousins and coworkers, and the guy who ran the auto parts store on 5th Street. Word spread the way it always did in that world, not through announcements or press releases, but through conversations at bar counters and garage bays, and the slow accumulation of people deciding that something mattered. Marcus was discharged from the hospital after 8 days. He went home to his apartment in Oklahoma City, a 2-bedroom place that felt too big and too empty, and he kept working the phones. A roofing contractor in Ardmore offered to fix the Jessup barn for free if someone could cover materials. A restaurant owner in Durant said he'd donate food for an event. A retired accountant who'd ridden with the club 20 years ago volunteered to look at Sarah's finances and see if there was anything the bank had missed. The pieces started coming together, slowly at first, then faster. 3 weeks after the accident, Marcus drove down to Ardmore. His arm was still in a sling, and the doctor had told him not to ride for at least another month, so he borrowed a truck from a friend and made the 2-hour drive with the windows down and the radio off. He needed the quiet. He needed to think. The Jessup farm looked different in daylight. The White House wasn't as pristine as he'd imagined. Paint peeling near the gutters, a shutter hanging crooked on one window. The barn roof sagged in the middle, and the fields that should have been planted with winter wheat lay brown and fallow. But there was something about the place that felt solid anyway, rooted, like it had weathered worse than this, and was waiting to weather more. Sarah met him on the porch. She looked tired, the kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix, but her handshake was firm and her eyes were clear. "Mr. Cole." "Marcus." He glanced around the property. "Place has good bones." "It's falling apart." "Falling apart can be fixed. It's the bones that matter." She studied him for a moment, like she was trying to figure out if he was selling something. Then she nodded toward the door. "Come inside. I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had read the letter from the bank, and Marcus laid out what he'd been building. The network of volunteers, the donated materials. The plan for a fundraiser that would bring people from across 3 states to this little farm outside Ardmore. "We're calling it a benefit ride," he said. "Bikers pay a registration fee, ride a route through the county, end up here for a barbecue and a concert. Local band already volunteered to play. We've got food covered, and a guy who does event insurance is giving us a deal." He slid a piece of paper across the table. "Conservative estimate. If we get 500 riders at $40 a head, that's $20,000. More than enough to cover the bank and have something left over." Sarah stared at the paper. Her hands were trembling just slightly, the way Marcus's hands trembled now when he tried to grip a wrench. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing all this?" Marcus had been expecting the question. He'd rehearsed answers in his head during the drive down, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like a speech or a sales pitch. But sitting here, in this kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, the rehearsed answers fell away. "Because your son reminded me of someone I used to be," he said. "Before I forgot." Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, slowly, like something had clicked into place. "When?" she asked. 3 weeks from Saturday. That gives us time to get the word out, get the permits, make sure everything's in order." He paused. "I know it's a lot to take in, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but I give you my word, Mrs. Jessup, this is going to work. Your boy's not going to lose his home." From somewhere outside, Marcus heard the sound of a tennis ball bouncing and a dog barking, and a child's laughter carried on the wind. Sarah turned toward the sound, and for the first time since he'd met her, something like a smile crossed her face. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." The Saturday of the benefit ride broke clear and cold, the kind of December morning that turned breath to fog and made the fields glitter with frost. Sarah had been awake since 4, unable to sleep, moving through the house in the dark and checking things that didn't need to be checked. The coffee pot, the folding tables stacked on the porch, the extension cords running out to the barn where the band would set up. She'd checked them all twice, then checked them again. Ethan found her on the porch at dawn, wrapped in one of Danny's old flannels, watching the sky turn from black to gray to pale winter gold. "Mom, what are you doing?" "Just watching." He climbed into the chair beside her, still in his pajamas, his red hair matted flat on one side from sleep. Max padded out behind him and settled at their feet with a groan. "Are they really coming?" Ethan asked. "All those motorcycles?" "That's what Marcus says." "How many?" "He said maybe 500. Could be more, could be less." She put her arm around him and pulled him close. "You nervous?" Ethan thought about it. "A little, but the good kind of nervous, like before a spelling test when you know you studied." Sarah smiled. "Yeah, like that." They sat together and watched the sun come up over the fields. Somewhere down County Road 12, the first engines were already warming up. The riders began arriving at 9. They came from the north and the south, from Oklahoma City and Tulsa and Dallas, from small towns with names Sarah had never heard and cities she'd only seen on maps. They came on Harleys and Indians and old Hondas held together with duct tape and stubbornness. They came in leather vests with patches from a dozen different clubs, and they came in plain jackets with no patches at all, just people who'd heard about a boy and a farm and decided it was worth a Saturday and a tank of gas. Sarah stood at the end of the driveway with Ethan beside her, watching the column of bikes roll in. The sound was enormous, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the ground itself, but it wasn't frightening. It was something else, something that felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. Marcus was near the front, riding in a sidecar attached to Razorback's bike. His arm was still in a sling, but he was grinning in a way that made him look 10 years younger. When the bike stopped, he climbed out carefully and walked over to Sarah and Ethan. "Told you," he said. Sarah shook her head. "You said 500. I said maybe 500. He turned and looked back at the road, where bikes were still coming over the rise, a river of chrome and leather that seemed to have no end. Looks like maybe was a little low. By 10 o'clock, the farm was full. Bikes lined the driveway, the fields, the shoulder of County Road 12 for a quarter mile in each direction. Volunteers directed traffic, handed out registration packets, pointed people toward the food tables in the barn and the porta-potties that had been delivered the day before. The local band was setting up on a flatbed trailer, their amps humming with feedback, and someone had strung Christmas lights along the fence, even though it was 3 weeks too early. Ethan moved through the crowd like a small diplomat, shaking hands with bikers who looked like they could bench press a truck and accepting high fives from women with tattoos and leather chaps. Everyone wanted to meet him. Everyone wanted to tell him he was brave, that what he'd done mattered, that they'd ridden 100 miles or 200 miles or 500 miles because they'd heard his story and couldn't stay home. He didn't know what to say to most of them, so he just said, "Thank you," over and over, until the words started to feel strange in his mouth, like they belonged to someone else. Around noon, a news van pulled up from the station in Oklahoma City. A reporter with perfect hair and a microphone asked Sarah if she'd be willing to say a few words on camera. She looked at Marcus, who shrugged. "Your call," he said, "but people should hear this story. Might help the next family in trouble." Sarah smoothed her hair, took a breath, and faced the camera. She talked about Danny, about the farm, about the bills that had piled up faster than she could pay them. She talked about Ethan and the accident and the man he'd helped without thinking twice. And she talked about the strangers who had become neighbors, the bikers who had shown up, not because they had to, but because they believed that kindness deserved an answer. When she finished, the reporter turned to Ethan. "What do you think about all this?" Ethan looked at the crowd, at the bikes, at the Christmas lights swaying in the cold breeze. "I think my dad would have liked it," he said. "He always said the best people are the ones who show up when it's hard." The reporter smiled. The cameraman gave a thumbs up, and somewhere in the crowd, Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and pretended it was the wind. The benefit ride itself launched at 1 o'clock. 814 bikes, someone had counted, rolling out of the Jessup farm in a column that stretched for miles. They rode a loop through Carter County, past fields and farmhouses and small towns, where people came out of their homes to watch. Some waved, some cheered. A few held up signs that said things like, "Thank you," and "God bless," and "Ride safe." Ethan rode in the sidecar with Marcus, his helmet too big for his head, his grin too big for his face. The wind was cold, but he didn't care. He watched the road unfurl ahead of them and felt the rumble of the engine in his chest and thought about his father, who had loved motorcycles and would have loved this. When they returned to the farm 2 hours later, the barbecue was ready. Brisket and ribs and pulled pork, donated by restaurants from 3 counties, coleslaw and beans and cornbread, pecan pie and apple cobbler, and a cake shaped like a motorcycle that someone's wife had stayed up all night to make. People ate. People talked. The band played country songs and classic rock and one slow ballad that made the older couples sway together in the fading afternoon light. Kids ran between the tables, chasing each other and the dogs that had shown up with their owners. It felt less like a fundraiser and more like a family reunion for a family that hadn't known it existed until today. As the sun began to set, Marcus found Sarah standing alone by the barn, watching the crowd. "Final count's in," he said. 814 riders at $40 each, plus the silent auction, the merchandise sales, and the jar someone put out for cash donations. He handed her a piece of paper. "Grand total." Sarah looked at the number. She read it twice, then a third time, because the first 2 times didn't make sense. "This can't be right." "It's right. I watched them count it." "Marcus, this is—" She couldn't finish. The number on the paper was $43,000, more than twice what she needed, enough to pay off the bank, fix the barn roof, and still have something left over. "People wanted to help," Marcus said. "You gave them a way to do it." Sarah pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet, but she was smiling. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to. Thank your son." Marcus nodded toward the crowd, where Ethan was sitting on a hay bale with Max at his feet, surrounded by bikers who were teaching him card tricks and letting him try on their sunglasses. "He's the one who started all this. I just made some phone calls." Sarah watched her son laugh at something one of the bikers said. The Christmas lights had come on, casting everything in a warm glow that made the farm look like something from a postcard. The sound of the band drifted across the field, mixing with the murmur of conversation and the distant rumble of bikes being started up as people began to head home. "Danny would have loved this," she said quietly. "I think he knows," Marcus said. "Somehow, I think he knows." Winter settled over Carter County in the weeks that followed, bringing early snows that dusted the fields and turned the roads treacherous. But inside the Jessup farmhouse, something had changed. The rooms felt warmer now, not just from the fire Sarah kept burning in the wood stove, but from something less tangible. A weight had lifted. The silence that had pressed down on them since Danny's death had softened into something quieter, more peaceful. The house was still too big for 2 people and a dog, but it no longer felt like a tomb. Sarah paid off the bank on a Tuesday morning in mid-December. She drove into Ardmore with the cashier's check in her purse, walked into the loan office, and handed it to a woman named Brenda, who had been sending her foreclosure notices for 8 months. Brenda looked at the check, then at Sarah, then back at the check. "This is the full amount," Brenda said, "plus 6 months ahead." "I know. Mrs. Jessup, I don't—" Brenda stopped herself, shook her head, and stamped the paperwork. "Well, congratulations. The farm is yours, free and clear." Sarah walked out of the bank into the cold December air and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, just breathing. Free and clear. The words felt foreign, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. She thought about Danny, about all the nights he'd sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, staring at bills they couldn't pay. She wished he could have been here to feel this, to know that the land his father had left him, and his father before that, would stay in the family after all. She drove home with the windows down, letting the cold air sting her cheeks, and she didn't cry until she pulled into the driveway and saw Ethan waiting on the porch with Max. The barn roof got fixed the week before Christmas. A crew of 6 men showed up at dawn on a Saturday, their trucks loaded with lumber and shingles and tools. Marcus was with them, his arm finally out of the sling, though he still moved carefully when he thought no one was watching. They worked through the day, their breath fogging in the cold, their hammers ringing out across the fields like church bells. Ethan helped where he could, carrying supplies and fetching water and holding boards steady while the men nailed them into place. He asked questions constantly about the tools, the techniques, the physics of load-bearing structures, and the men answered patiently, teaching him the way fathers teach sons when there's time and willingness and no rush to be anywhere else. By sunset, the barn had a new roof. The men stood back and admired their work, passing around thermoses of coffee and slapping each other on the back. Someone had brought a cooler of beer, and someone else had brought a portable speaker that played old country songs into the darkening sky. Marcus found Ethan sitting on the fence, watching the last light fade over the fields. "Not bad for a day's work," Marcus said. "It looks good." Ethan kicked his heels against the fence post. "My dad tried to fix that roof once. He got about halfway done, and then it rained for a week, and he had to stop. He always said he'd finish it, but—" He trailed off. Marcus leaned against the fence beside him. "Your dad sounds like a good man." "He was." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he'd be proud of me?" The question came out small, almost swallowed by the wind. Marcus turned and looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw the same thing he'd seen on the road that day in November. A kid carrying something too heavy, trying not to let it show. "I think he'd be the proudest father in Oklahoma," Marcus said, "and I think he already was, long before any of this happened." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else, but something in his shoulders loosened, like a knot finally coming undone. Christmas came and went. Sarah put up a tree for the first time since Danny died, and Ethan helped her hang the ornaments they'd collected over the years, the wooden reindeer from their first Christmas together, the glass angel Danny's mother had given them, the construction paper star Ethan had made in kindergarten. They didn't talk much while they decorated. They didn't need to. The tree said everything that needed saying. On Christmas morning, a package arrived on the porch. No return address, just Ethan's name written in neat block letters. Inside was a leather jacket, sized for a boy, with a patch sewn onto the back. The patch showed a motorcycle and a winding road, and underneath it were the words, "Ethan Jessup, honorary member, Iron Confederates." Ethan wore the jacket for 3 days straight, even to bed, until Sarah finally insisted he take it off so she could wash his pajamas. Spring came early that year, the way it sometimes does in Oklahoma, teasing warmth in February before retreating back into cold. But by March, the fields were greening up, and Sarah had started talking about planting again. Nothing big, not yet. Maybe just a kitchen garden to start, some tomatoes and peppers and squash. Something to get her hands back in the dirt. Marcus came down from Oklahoma City every few weeks. Sometimes he brought other riders with him, men who'd been at the benefit and wanted to check in on the family they'd helped. They'd sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about motorcycles and weather and nothing in particular. Ethan would show them whatever he was working on: a school project, a model engine he was building from a kit, a drawing of a bike he'd designed himself. They treated him like one of their own, which he was now in all the ways that mattered. On the first Saturday in April, Marcus arrived with something in the bed of his truck covered by a tarp. Ethan ran out to meet him, Max barking at his heels, and watched as Marcus pulled back the cover. It was a motorcycle. Not a big one. A small Honda, old but well-maintained, the kind of bike a person could learn on without getting hurt. The chrome had been polished until it gleamed, and someone had painted the gas tank a deep, rich red. "It's not road legal," Marcus said. "Not until you're older. But I figured you could practice on the property, get a feel for it." He glanced at Sarah, who had come out onto the porch with her arms crossed. "If your mom says it's okay." Ethan turned to his mother, his eyes wide, his whole body vibrating with a hope he was trying not to show. Sarah looked at the bike, then at her son, then at Marcus. She thought about Danny, who had taught Ethan to love motorcycles before he could even ride a bicycle. She thought about the accident on County Road 12, the rain and the deer, and the man her son had saved. She thought about all the ways the world could hurt you, and all the ways it could surprise you, and how sometimes those two things were the same. "Helmet," she said, "every single time." Ethan's grin could have powered the whole county. That afternoon, Marcus taught him the basics: how to balance, how to brake, how to respect the machine and the road it traveled. They puttered around the property at 5 miles an hour, Ethan's hands white-knuckled on the handlebars, his laughter carrying across the fields. Sarah watched from the porch, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Max sat beside her, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, too old now to chase anything but content to watch. She thought about the night Danny died, the hospital room and the machines and the terrible silence that followed. She thought about the months after, the bills and the fear, and the feeling that the world had narrowed to a point so small she could barely breathe. And she thought about now, the sun on the fields, her son on a motorcycle, a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Kindness, she realized, wasn't just a single act. It was a chain, each link forged by someone choosing to help when they didn't have to. Ethan had helped a stranger on a wet road. That stranger had helped them. And someday, Ethan would help someone else, and the chain would grow longer, reaching into places none of them could see. The motorcycle circled back toward the house, Ethan waving with one hand, while Marcus shouted at him to keep both hands on the grips. Sarah laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't heard from herself in years. The farm was still standing, her son was still smiling. And somewhere out there, 800 riders were carrying a story about a boy who did the right thing and a world that answered back. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.